Whether the narrative of the anointing is inserted in its chronological order we cannot say, for the evangelist gives us no word by which we may recognize either its time or its place relation, but we can easily see that it falls into the story artistically, with a singular fitness. Going back to the context, we find Jesus pronouncing a high eulogium upon John the Baptist. Hereupon the evangelist adds a statement of his own, calling attention to the fact that even John's ministry failed to reach and influence the Pharisees and lawyers, who rejected the counsel of God and declined the baptism of his messenger. Then Jesus, in one of his brief but exquisite parables, sketches the character of the Pharisees. Recalling a scene of the marketplace, where the children were accustomed to play at weddings and funerals, which, by the way, are the only games at which the children of the land play today, and where sometimes the play was spoiled and stopped by some of the children getting into a pet, and lapsing into a sullen silence, Jesus says that is just a picture of the childish perversity of the Pharisees. They respond neither to the mourning of the one nor to the music of the other, but because John came neither eating bread nor drinking wine, they call him a maniac, and say, he hath a devil, while of Jesus, who has no ascetic ways, but mingles in the gatherings of social life, a man amongst men, they say, behold a gluttonous man and a wine-bibber, a friend of publicans and sinners. And having recorded this, our evangelist inserts, as an appropriate sequel, the account of the supper in the Pharisee's house, with its idyllic interlude, played by a woman's hand, a narrative which shows how wisdom is justified of all her children, and how these condescensions of Jesus, his intercourse with even those who were ceremonially or morally unclean, were both proper and beautiful. 2. It was in one of the Galilean towns, perhaps at Nain, where Jesus was surprised at receiving an invitation to the house of a Pharisee. Such courtesies on the part of a class who prided themselves on their exclusiveness, and who were bitterly intolerant of all who were outside their narrow circle, were exceptional and rare. Besides, the teaching of Jesus was diametrically opposed to the leaven of the Pharisees. Between the caste of the one and the Catholicism of the other was a wide gulf of divergence. To Jesus the heart was everything, and the outflowing issues were colored by its hues. To the Pharisees the hand, the outward touch, was more than the heart, and contact more than conduct. Jesus laid a divine emphasis upon character. The cleanness he demanded was moral cleanness, purity of heart. That of the Pharisees was a ceremonial cleanness, the avoidance of things which were under a ceremonial ban. And so they magnified the jots and tittles, scrupulously tithing their mint and anise, while they overlooked completely the moralities of the heart, and reduced to a mere nothing those grander virtues of mercy and of justice. Between the separatists and Jesus there was therefore constant friction, which afterwards developed into open hostility, and while they ever sought to damage him with opprobrious epithets, and to bring his teaching into disrepute, he did not fail to expose their hollowness and insincerity, tearing off the veneer with which they sought to hide the brood of viperous things their creed had gendered, and to hurl against their whited sepulchres his indignant woes. 3. It would almost seem as if Jesus hesitated in accepting the invitation, for the tense of the verb desired implies that the request was repeated. Possibly other arrangements had been made, or perhaps Jesus sought to draw out and test the sincerity of the Pharisee, who in kind and courteous words offered his hospitality. The hesitation would certainly not arise from any reluctance on his part, for Jesus refused no open door, he welcomed any opportunity of influencing a soul. As the shepherd of his own parable went over the mountainous paths in quest of his lone lost sheep, so Jesus was glad to risk unkind aspersions, and to bear the fierce light of hostile, questioning eyes, if he might but rescue a soul, and win some erring one back to virtue and to truth. The character of the host we cannot exactly determine. The narrative lights up his features but indistinctly, for the nameless sinner is the central object of the picture, while Simon stands in the background, out of focus, and so somewhat veiled in obscurity. To many he appears as the cold and heartless censor, distant and haughty, seeking by the guile of hospitality to entrap Jesus, hiding behind the mask of friendship some dark and sinister motive. But such deep shadows are cast by our own thoughts rather than by the narrative, they are the random guesses after truth, instead of the truth itself. It will be noticed that Jesus does not impugn in the least his motive in proffering his hospitality, and this, though but a negative evidence, is not without its weight, when on a similar occasion the evil motive was brought to light. The only charge laid against him, if charge it be, was the omission of certain points of etiquette that Eastern hospitality was accustomed to observe, and even here there is nothing to show that Jesus was treated differently from the other invited guests. The omission, while it failed to single out Jesus for special honor, might still mean no disrespect, and at the most it was a breach of manners, deportment, rather than of morals, just one of those lapses Jesus was most ready to overlook and forgive. We shall form a juster estimate of the man's character if we regard him as a seeker after truth. Evidently he has felt a drawing towards Jesus. Indeed, ver. 47 Luke 7:47 would almost imply that he had received some personal benefit at his hand. Be this as it may, he is desirous of a closer and a freer intercourse. His mind is perplexed, the balances of his judgment swinging in alternate and opposite ways. A new problem has presented itself to him, and in that problem is one factor he cannot yet value. It is the unknown quantity, Jesus of Nazareth. Who is he? What is he? A prophet, the Christ? Such are the questions running through his mind, questions which must be answered soon, as his thoughts and opinions have ripened into convictions. And so he invites Jesus to his house and board, that in the nearer vision and the unfettered freedom of social intercourse he may solve the great enigma. Nay, he invites Jesus with a degree of earnestness, putting upon him the constraint of a great desire, and leaving his heart open to conviction, ready to embrace the truth as soon as he recognizes it to be truth. He flings open the door of his hospitalities, though in so doing he shakes the whole fabric of Pharisaic exclusiveness and sanctity. Seeking after truth, the truth finds him. 4. There was a simplicity and freeness in the social life of the East which our Western civilization can scarcely understand. The door of the guest chamber was left open, and the uninvited, even comparative strangers, were allowed to pass in and out during the entertainment, or they might take their seats by the wall, as spectators and listeners. It was so here. No sooner have the guests taken their places, reclining around the table, their bared feet projecting behind them, than the usual drift of the uninvited set in, amongst whom, almost unnoticed in the excitements of the hour, was a woman of the city. Simon in his soliloquy speaks of her as a sinner, but had we his testimony only, we should hesitate in giving to the word its usually received meaning, for sinner was a pet term of the Pharisees, applied to all who were outside their circle, and even to Jesus himself. But when our evangelist, in describing her character, makes use of the same word, we can only interpret the sinner in one way, in its sensual, depraved meaning. And with this agrees the phrase "a woman which was in the city," which seems to indicate the loose relations of her to public life. 5. Bearing in her hand an alabaster cruse of ointment, for a purpose which soon became apparent, she passed over to the place where Jesus sat, and stood directly behind him. Accustomed as she had been to hide her deeds in the veil of darkness, nothing but the current of a deep emotion could have carried her thus through the door of the guest chamber, setting her, alone of her sex, full in the glare of the lamps and the light of scornful eyes, and no sooner has she reached her goal than the storm of the heart breaks in a rain of tears, which fall hot and fast upon the feet of the Master. This, however, is no part of her plan. They were impromptu tears she could not restrain, and instantly she stoops down, and with the loosened tresses of her hair she wipes his feet, kissing them passionately as she did so. There is a delicate meaning in the construction of the Greek verb, she began to wet his feet with her tears. It implies that the action was not continued, as when afterwards she anointed his feet. It was momentary, instantaneous, checked soon as it was discovered. Then pouring from her flask the fragrant nard, she proceeded with loving, leisurely haste to anoint his feet, until the whole chamber was redolent of the sweet perfume. 6. But what is the meaning of this strange episode, this song without words, struck by the woman's hands as from a lyre of alabaster. It was evidently something determined, prearranged. The phrase "when she knew that he was sitting at meat" means something more than she heard. Her knowledge as to where Jesus was had not come to her in a casual way, in the vagrant gossip of the town. It had come by search and inquiry on her part, as if the plan were already determined, and she were eager to carry it out. The cruse of ointment that she brings also reveals the settled resolve that she came on purpose, and she came only, to anoint the feet of Jesus. The word, to, rendered "she brought" has a deeper meaning than our translation conveys. It is a word that is used in 10 other passages of the New Testament, where it is invariably rendered receive, or received, referring to something received as a wage, or as a gift, or as a prize. Used here in the narrative, it implies that the cruse of ointment had not been bought, it was something she had received as a gift, or possibly as the wages of her sin. And not only was it prearranged, part of a deliberate intention, but evidently it was not displeasing to Jesus. He did not resent it. He gives himself up passively to the woman's will. He allows her to touch, and even to kiss his feet, though he knows that to society she is a moral leper, and that her fragrant ointment is possibly the reward of her shame. We must, then, look behind the deed to the motive. To Jesus the ointment and the tears were full of meaning, eloquent beyond any power of words. 7. Can we discover that meaning, and read why they were so welcome? We think we may. And here let us say that Simon's thoughts were perfectly natural and correct, with no word or tone that we can censure. Canon Farrar, it is true, detects in the "this man" with which he speaks of Jesus a supercilious scorn, but we fail to see the least scorn, or even disrespect, for the pronoun Simon uses is the identical word used by St. Matthew 3:3 of John the Baptist, when he says, "This is he that was spoken of by the prophet Esaias, and the word of the voice from heaven which said, This is my beloved Son." Matthew 3:17 That the woman was a sinner Simon knew well, arid would not Jesus know it too, if he were a prophet? Doubtless he would, but as Simon marks no sign of disapproval upon the face of Jesus, the enigmatical "if" grows larger in his mind, and he begins to think that Jesus has scarcely the prescience, the power of seeing through things that a true prophet would have. Simon's reasoning was right, but his facts were wrong. He imagined that Jesus did not know who and what manner of woman this was, whereas Jesus knew more than he, for he knew not only the past of shame, but a present of forgiveness and hope. 8. And what did the tears and the ointment mean, that Jesus should receive them so readily, and that he should speak of them so approvingly? The parable Jesus spoke to Simon will explain it. "Simon, I have somewhat to say unto thee," said Jesus, answering his thoughts, for he had heard them by words. And falling naturally into the parabolic form of speech as he did when he wanted to make his meaning more startling and impressive, he said, "A certain money lender had 2 debtors, the one owed 500 pence, and the other 50. When they had not wherewith to pay, he forgave them both. Which of them therefore will love him most?" A question to which Simon could promptly answer, "He, I suppose, to whom he forgave the most." It is clear, then, whatever others might see in the woman's deed, that Jesus read in it the expression of her love, and that he accepted it as such. The tears and outpoured ointment were the broken utterances of an affection which was too deep for words. But if her offering, as it certainly was the gift of love, how shall we explain her tears? For love, in the presence of the beloved, does not weep so passionately, indeed does not weep at all, except, it may be, tears of joy, or tears of a mutual sorrow. In this way, as the wind blows landward from the sea, the mountain ranges cool the clouds, and cause them to unlock their treasures, in the fertile and refreshing rains, so in the heart of the sinner a cloud of recollections is blown up suddenly from her dark past. The memories of her shame, even though that shame be now forgiven, sweep across her soul with resistless force, for penitence does not end when forgiveness is assured, and as she finds herself in the presence of infinite purity. What wonder that the heart's great deeps are broken up? and that the wild storm of conflicting emotions within should find relief in a rain of tears. Tears of penitence they doubtless were, bitter with the sorrow and the shame of years of guilt, but they were tears of gratitude and holy love as well, all suffused and brightened by the touch of mercy and the light of hope. And so the passionate weeping was no acted grief, no hysterical tempest, it was the perfectly natural accompaniment of profound emotion, that storm of mingled but diverse elements which now swept through her soul. Her tears, like the dewdrops that hang upon leaf and flower, were wrought in the darkness, fashioned by the night, and at the same time they were the jewels that graced the robe of a new dawn, the dawn of a better, a purer life. 9. But how came this new affection within her heart, an affection so deep that it must have tears and anointings for its expression, this new affection, which has become a pure and holy passion, and which breaks through conventional bonds, as it has broken through the old habits, the ill usages of a life? Jesus himself traces for us this affection to its source. He tells us, for the parable is all meaningless unless we recognize in the 500-pence debtor the sinning woman that her great love grows out of her great forgiveness, a past forgiveness too, for Jesus speaks of the change as already accomplished. Her sins, which were many, have been forgiven. And here we touch an unwritten chapter of the divine life, for as the woman's love flows up around Jesus, casting its treasures at his feet, so the forgiveness must first have come from Jesus. His voice it must have been which said, "Let there be light," and which turned the chaos of her dark soul into another paradise. At any rate, she thinks she owes to him her all. Her new creation, with its deliverance from the tyrannous past, her new joys and hopes, the spring blossom of a new and heavenly existence, the conscious purity which has now taken the place of lust, she owes all to the word and power of Jesus. But when this change took place, or when, in the great transit, this Venus of the moral firmament passed across the disk of the sun, we do not know. St. John inserts in his story one little incident, which is like a piece of mosaic dropped out from the Gospels of the Synoptists, of a woman who was taken in her sin and brought to Jesus. And when the hands of her accusers were not clean enough to cast the first stone, but they shrank one by one out of sight, self-condemned, Jesus bade the penitent one to go in peace, and sin no more. Are the two characters identical? And does the forgiven one, dismissed into peace, now return to bring to her Savior her offering of gratitude and love? We can only say that such an identification is at least possible, and more so far than the improbable identification of tradition, which confounds this nameless sinner with Mary Magdalene, which is an assumption perfectly baseless and most unlikely. 10. And so in this erring one, who now puts her crown of fragrance upon the feet of Jesus, since she is unworthy to put it upon his head, we see a penitent and forgiven soul. Somewhere Jesus found her, out on the forbidden paths, the paths of sin, which, steep and slippery, lead down to death. His look arrested her, for it cast within her heart the light of a new hope. His presence, which was the embodiment of a purity infinite and absolute, shot through her soul the deep consciousness and conviction of her guilt, and doubtless upon her ears had fallen the words of the great absolution and the divine benediction, "Thy sins are all forgiven, go in peace," words which to her made all things new, a new heart within, and a new earth around. And now, regenerate and restored, the sad past forgiven, all the currents of her thought and life reversed, the love of sin turned into a perfect loathing, her language, spoken in tears, kisses, and fragrant nard, is the language of the psalmist, "O Lord, I will praise thee, for though thou wast angry with me, thine anger is turned away, and thou comfortedst me." It was the Magnificat of a forgiven and a loving soul. 11. Simon had watched the woman's actions in silence, though in evident displeasure. He would have resented her touch, and have forbade even her presence, but found under his roof, she became in a certain sense a guest, shielded by the hospitable courtesies of Eastern life. But if he said nothing, he thought much, and his thoughts were hard and bitter. He looked upon the woman as a moral leper, an outcast. There was defilement in her touch, and he would have shaken it off from him as if it were a viper, fit only to be cast into the fire of a burning indignation. Now Jesus must teach him a lesson, and throw his thoughts back upon himself. And first he teaches him that there is forgiveness for sin, even the sin of uncleanness, and in this we see the bringing in of a better hope. The law said, "The soul that sinneth, it shall surely die, it shall be cut off from the people of Israel." The law had but one voice for the adulterer and adulteress, the voice which was the knell of a sharp and fearful doom, without reprieve or mercy of any kind. It cast upon them the deadly rain of stones, as if it would hurl a whole Sinai upon them. But Jesus comes to man with a message of mercy and of hope. He proclaims a deliverance from the sin, and a pardon for the sinner, nay, he offers himself, as at once the forgiver of sin and the Savior from sin. Let him but see it repented of, let him but see the tears of penitence, or hear the sighs of a broken and contrite heart, and he steps forward at once to deliver and to save. The valley of Acre, where the law sets up its memorial of shame, Jesus turns into a door of hope. He speaks life where the law spoke death, he offers hope where the law gave but despair, and where exacting law gave pains and fearful punishment only, the mediator of the new covenant, to the penitent though erring ones, spoke pardon and peace, even the perfect peace, the eternal peace. 12. And Jesus teaches Simon another lesson. He teaches him to judge himself, and not either by his own fictitious standard, by the Pharisaic table of excellence, by the divine standard. Holding up as a mirror the example of the woman, Jesus gives to Simon a portrait of his own self, as seen in the heavenly light, all shrunken and dwarfed, the large eye of Pharisaic complacency becoming, in comparison, small indeed. Turning to the woman, he said unto Simon, "Seest thou this woman?" And Simon had not seen her, he had only seen her shadow, the shadow of her sinful past. "I entered into thine house, thou gavest me no water for my feet, but she hath wetted my feet with her tears, and wiped them with her hair. Thou gavest me no kiss, but she, since the time I came in, hath not ceased to kiss my feet. My head with oil thou didst not anoint, but she hath anointed my feet with ointment." It is a problem of the pronouns, in which the I being given, it is desired to find the relative values of thou and she. And how beautifully does Jesus work it out, according to the rules of divine proportions. With what antithetical skill does he make his comparison, or rather his contrast. "Thou gavest me no water for my feet, she hath wetted my feet with her tears, and wiped them with her hair. Thou gavest me no kiss, she hath not ceased to kiss my feet. My head with oil thou didst not anoint, she hath anointed my feet with ointment." 13. And so Jesus sets over against the omissions of Simon the loving and lavish attentions of the woman, and while reproving him, not for a lack of civility, but for want of heartiness in his reception of himself, he shows how deep and full run the currents of her affection, breaking through the banks and bounds of conventionality in their sweet overflow, while as yet the currents of his love were intermittent, shallow, and somewhat cold. He does not denounce the Simon as having no part or lot in this matter. No, he even credits him with a little love, as he speaks of him as a pardoned, justified soul. And it was true. The heart of Simon had been drawn toward Jesus, and in the urgent invitation and these proffered hospitalities we can discern a nascent affection. His love is yet but in the bud. It is there, a thing of life, but it is confined, constrained, and lacking the sweetness of the ripened and opened flower. Jesus does not cut off the budding affection, and cast it out amongst the withered and dead things, but sprinkling it with the dew of his speech, and throwing upon it the sunshine of his approving look, he leaves it to develop, ripening into an after-harvest of fragrance and of beauty. And why was Simon's love more feeble and immature than that of the woman? First, because he did not see so much in Jesus as she did. He was yet stumbling over the if, with some lingering doubts as to whether he were the prophet. To her he is more than a prophet, even her Lord and her Savior, covering her past with a mantle of mercy, and opening within her heart a heaven. Then, too, Simon's forgiveness was not so great as hers. Not that any forgiveness can be less than entire, for when heaven saves it is not a salvation by installments, certain sins remitted, while others are held back uncancelled. But Simon's views of sin were not so sharp and vivid as were those of the woman. The atmosphere of Phariseeism in its moral aspects was hazy, it magnified human virtues, and created all sorts of elusive mirages of self-righteousness and reputed holiness, and doubtless Simon's vision had been impaired by the refracting atmosphere of his creed. The greatness of our salvation is ever measured by the greatness of our danger and our guilt. The heavier the burden and weight of condemnation, the deeper is the peace and the higher are the ecstasies of joy when that condemnation is removed. Shall we say, then, we must sin more, that love may more abound? Nay, we need not, we must not, for as Godet says, what is wanting to the best of us, in order to love much, is not sin, but the knowledge of it. And this deeper knowledge of sin, the more vivid realization of its guilt, its virulence, its all-pervasiveness, comes just in proportion as we approach Christ. Standing close up to the cross, feeling the mortal agonies of him whose death was necessary as sin's atonement, in that vivid light of redeeming love even the strict moralist, the Pharisee of the Pharisees, could speak of himself as the chief of sinners. 14. The lesson was over, and Jesus dismissed the woman who, with her empty alabaster flask, had lingered at the feast, and who had heard all the conversation with the double assurance of pardon, "Thy sins are forgiven, thy faith hath saved thee, go in peace." And such is the divine order everywhere and always: faith, love, peace. Faith is the procuring cause, or the condition of salvation, love and peace are its after-fruits, for without faith, love would be only fear, and peace itself would be unrest. She went in peace, the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, but she left behind her the music of her tears and the sweet fragrance of her deed, a fragrance and a music which have filled the whole world, and which, floating across the valley of death, will pass up into heaven itself. There was still one little whisper of murmuring, or questioning rather, for the guests were startled by the boldness of his words, and asked among themselves, "Who is this that even forgiveth sins?" But it will be noticed that Simon himself is no longer among the questioners, the doubters. Jesus is to him the prophet, and more than a prophet, for who can forgive sins but God alone? And though we hear no more of him or of his deeds, we may rest assured that his conquered heart was given without reserve to Jesus, and that he too learned to love with a true affection, even with the perfect love, which casteth out fear.